today, but I knew that DC had to be my next stop because there are so many folks from West Virginia who are here and for whom I think the themes in this book are going to resonate a lot. I'm super excited to be here with Nicole. She's downplaying a little bit, but she also just, the post, was it last Sunday, ran the article related to the no-knocks. A huge story about no-knock warrants, and the podcast is incredible and is, I think, going to make people think really hard about what place no-knock warrants have and whether they should have that place in our justice system. And that's all I'll say. I'm going to read you 2 essays, and then we'll talk a little bit, and then there'll be time for you to ask questions, make comments, whatever kind of you feel like. And we should have a good time together. So the first essay I'm going to read to you is called Present Life Hair. My mother says the hair we were born with isn't our own. It belongs to the person we were in our past life. So what does it mean that my first head of hair, the soft, bronzy black ringlets of my toddlerhood, is still her favorite? Once shorn as dictated by Hindu ritual to release the old soul and make room for the new, the hair that grew back on my head was darker, coarse, and frizzy. It tangled easily, and my mother's efforts to untangle it each week, sans conditioner, a product yet undiscovered in our immigrant household, brought me to tears each time. We were strangers in West Virginia, the state where my parents decided to make a home. Strange because of our immigration status, strange because of our anomalous brown skin in an astoundingly white state. My parents could not control much about how the world would receive my sister and me. The racism, the xenophobia, the sheer ignorance about our culture and faith. But what they could control, they did. Our appearance. Keeping our heads down, being well-groomed, not standing out any more than we already did, they thought, would keep us safe. My parents required us to dress up in church clothes to go to the dentist, the ice skating rink, or the mall. The first time my sister wore jeans with holes torn at the knees, my father's response was, I didn't move to the United States from India for my children to dress the way poor children do on the streets of Bombay. And when it came to the subject of our hair, the worst comment my mother could make about us was to say that our hair looked lagrajeva, which is to say, wildly unkempt. The Gujarati people in the room just laughed. The message was clear. A good Indian girl was docile and feminine. My older sister conformed to this standard for much of her time at home. But I, the typical second child in many ways, began to push back early. Played basketball starting at age 6, watched football alone in the basement on Sundays, refused to wear dresses the minute I was old enough to express an opinion about my clothing. Hair quickly became the only point of control my parents had over my gender expression. My regulated hair represented my regulated self. I am ashamed to admit this, but my mother combed my hair all the way through 6th grade. I struggle with spatial reasoning and with fine motor skills. Thus, the skill of braiding down my back eluded me. It eludes me still. Each morning, I sat on the peach carpet in her bedroom while she perched on the edge of the bed behind me. She slathered her hands with oil, worked it through my locks, and then pulled my hair into the tight waist-length braid that can be seen in most photographs from my childhood. To this day, I cannot cook with coconut oil. The smell it releases when it hits the pan and begins to warm, the white congealed lump slowly transforming into clear liquid, reminds me so viscerally of hair. Long, thick, black, rope-like hair came to symbolize femininity for me. My mother had that hair. My sister had that hair. My grandmothers, my aunts, my cousins, my West Virginia Indian aunties all had that hair. Every Bollywood actress in the black and white 60s and 70s films we watched in my house growing up also had that hair. Nargis, Madhubala, Shabana Azmi. These gorgeous curvy women with dark eyes and heart-shaped faces all had dark hair parted down the middle and plaited all the way down their backs. Their dance scenes in white, rain-drenched saris were my first introduction to what it meant for an Indian woman to be sexy, to be the object of desire. They defined beauty, they defined womanhood, and they felt so far away from the woman I felt myself becoming. When middle school started, I was no longer willing to be dependent on my mother and became desperate to fit in with my peers. I announced my intentions to my parents, then walked from my house to my shop hair salon a few blocks down Big Tyler Road the week before school started. I asked them to chop off my braid, taking my waist-length hair up to shoulder length, and to give me bangs. My parents refused to pay for a perm, or I probably would have ended up with one of those too. In my 7th grade school picture, I exude all the awkwardness of adolescence. Glasses, braces, a silk shirt, and hairsprayed bangs popped a full 2 inches out from my forehead. There is a palpable desperation evident in the photo, a need to find myself in a world where I didn't really fit. Cross Lanes, West Virginia in the early 90s was home to maybe 7 Indian families total. In my middle school of 600, no more than 10 of us were not white. And my mother's definition of beauty, the one I learned as a child, held no meaning in the halls of Andrew Jackson Middle School. My best friend at the time could not have been more the opposite of me. She was Mormon, all arms and legs, with blonde hair that flowed halfway down her back. Even on mornings when we had volleyball practice at 6:15, she woke early enough to wash and blow dry her hair, put it in curlers, let it set, then shake out and hairspray the living daylights out of it. Her hair, her ice blue eyes, and her pert turned up nose made her the queen bee at our school, the standard that all the other girls aspired to. One that I, brown and bow-legged, with my weird hairsprayed bangs, knew that I could never reach. But maybe, I thought, being proximate to the object of every boy's desire would somehow make me more desirable. I watched her execute her morning beauty routine after sleepovers. I envied it, and I also knew it was something that would never fly in my household. Not the hairdryer, not the curling iron, not the makeup, not the 90 minutes of beautifying before leaving the house. If you've met my dad, you'll know why. My classmates' ideas about beauty, based on the country music singers and Hollywood stars of the day, revolved around pale skin, light eyes, light hair, features that were a biological impossibility for me. No matter how big I made my hair, how tight my jeans, how shiny my cowboy boots, I was never going to look like Reba McEntire or Faith Hill. And trust me, I still have the cowboy hat in a box somewhere to prove that I once tried. So what was I supposed to look like? If neither the beauty standards of my classmates nor those of my mother and her beloved Bollywood stars felt like the right ones, then what models existed in the world for me? My hair came to symbolize this effort to figure out who I was supposed to be in the world. What look was right for me in a world where the looks that existed simply didn't seem to fit. If you were to flip through an album of photographs of me between middle school and now, you would see that I've had my hair at every possible length and cut in every possible style since that first cut in 7th grade. Page boys and ponytails, pixie cuts and bobs, and at some low moments, haircuts that range from looking like a mushroom to a mop to a mullet. Yet none of these cuts made me feel desirable or desired. Beyond appearance, deeper questions also tormented me. Who was I supposed to desire? Who was supposed to desire me? Many of my white classmates were of the opinion that I should date the only Indian boy in our class. But he and I grew up together, slept at each other's houses, treated each other's parents as our own. This idea bordered on incestuous. I, meanwhile, thought I was supposed to desire the clean-cut, football-playing All-American boys who ended up being homecoming king. The ones who were kind to me and not hurling racist epithets, but who ultimately saw me as some kind of asexual being, existing outside their schema when it came to dating and desire. I didn't date in any serious way until I was 30. I tried half-heartedly, went on lots of first dates with dorky Indian boys I found on online dating sites, but never found a relationship that fit. In large part, I think because I was still trying to heed the mixed messages about gender and attraction I absorbed growing up Indian in West Virginia. Until I realized that the reason neither my mother's beauty standard nor that of my West Virginia peers felt like the ones I could fit into was because I didn't. I didn't conform to the gender norms of either of those cultures, not in my clothing, not in my mannerisms, not in my way of being, and not ultimately in my decision to spend the rest of my life with the woman I love instead of with the man I was expected to love by both of those societies. In 2015, I cut off my hair for good. After 35 years on Earth, I finally settled on a hairstyle that feels right to me, even if it doesn't look like anything my Indian family or my West Virginian peers would ever condone. I've gone to see my sweet Colombian stylist, Luis, every 5 weeks for the last 6 years. Each time I sit down in his chair, he begins by asking, "So, what do you want me to do this time?" And each time I answer the same way. "I trust you." When he puts his hands in my hair, there's none of the discomfort I associate with those childhood braiding sessions in my parents' bedroom. Instead, there's this incredible sensation of freedom that fills me. Like me, Luis is queer. He has no expectations of what my hair should look like or what I should look like. His only goal is that I feel good about how I look. And when I'm done with the session and he spins me around in the chair to get a look at my head in the mirror, for the first time since those past life ringlets, I actually do feel good. I look cute. My hair looks sharp. These are not words I ever used to describe myself growing up in West Virginia. My hair is cut short and close to my head, a spiky crew cut when it's at its shortest, a pixie cut with a stubborn cowlick shooting up from my scalp at its longest, with salt and pepper streaks at the temples that are increasingly more salt than pepper. During the pandemic, I even took this look one step further and let Luis give me a faux hawk that he then dyed a deep burgundy. Occasionally, when I'm walking in Jamaica Plain, I'll see a younger Indian woman dressed like me, in a t-shirt and jeans with short hair and a gender non-conforming swagger. And my heart will skip a beat, because suddenly I'm not alone in this style. There are more of us. And through our very existence, we make the existence of more of us possible. We become our own Shabana Azmis, our own Reva McEntyres. They're still paying sometimes though. Moments when I feel as though my decisions have put me at odds with my culture and my family. When I look at photos of myself from weddings and see the combination of sari and short hair, I, like my mother, feel that it looks weird. My hair does not mirror the flowing locks of Nargis or Madhubala, or my mother, or my sister. My hairstyle doesn't fit, and neither in those moments do I. I wish sometimes that it had been easier to default into my mother's definition of beauty, to wholly embrace that Indianness, that notion of femininity, which feels most like home to me, even as I don't feel fully at home within it. Indeed, the sweetest memories I have of time spent in India are still those when I sat on the floor, braced by the shins of my aunts, and played with the folds of their saris while they worked oil through my hair. I haven't been back in 7 years, and I still find myself missing that connection, that intimacy. But every time I visit my 14-year-old niece, whose long hair rivals that of her mother's, she will inevitably snuggle up beside me and run her hands through my short hair, form it into peaks, and then smooth it down again. Scrunch her fingers through it and massage my scalp. Get rubber bands and clips and style it into ridiculous tiny ponytails sprouting from all sides of my head. I don't have to ask. She does it in a way that feels both habitual and intentional, as if to say that my hair, though not like hers or her mother's or her grandmother's, is still enough. That I, her short-haired Masi in a family of long-haired women, the only of her Masis married to another Masi, I'm enough. Thanks. So that one made you laugh. This next one might make you cry a little bit. I promise both. And there are a couple seats up here. I don't know, folks in the back, if you want to sit, there are definitely 3 or 4 seats up here. Thanks. Yeah. So this next essay is called Our Armor. It's a collage essay and it has 3 sections. So I'll just name the sections as I go. 1. My mother's morning preparations always took the same form. She emerged from the bathroom after her shower, the air around her perfumed by a heady mix of talcum powder and baby oil. Dressed in a blouse and petticoat, the softness of her belly just spilled over the tightness of the drawstring waist. From my perch on her bed, I watched her get ready for the day ahead, following her movements through her reflection in the mirror. First, she mercilessly attacked the knots in her waist-length hair with a plastic comb, then used her slender fingers to divide the hair into 3 equal sections, which she braided without looking, only pulling the braid over her shoulder when her arms could no longer reach far enough down her back. Next, she wrapped a sari around her body, pleating and draping 6 yards of silk with a tailor's precision. Last, she put on her ornaments, thin gold bangles that jangled solidly on her wrists, small gold hoop earrings, a black and gold pearl Mangalsutra around her neck, a black mascara Janlo on her forehead. Ensemble complete, she stepped out of her home and into the wilds of small town West Virginia. In such a foreign context, she opted to own her foreignness rather than hide it on her walks to school, at her job as an accountant, during her service on the board of the local library, as a troop leader for the Girl Scouts. The Janlo was a marker of marriage for Indian women of my mother's generation. It has many names. Tilak and Bindi are 2 of the most common, but in Gujarati, Janlo is the preferred one. Placed between the eyebrows at the site of the 6th chakra, it's said to represent the 3rd eye and the notion of hidden wisdom. Indian women in India mark their heads with vermilion powder or with tiny stickers in a multitude of shapes, colors, and designs to match each of their saris. For my mother, none of these options were available. There was no Indian grocery store where she could purchase vermilion or sheets of Janlo stickers. So she did what immigrants in America always do to survive. She modified. Bought mascara from Rite Aid, perfected the art of drawing a tiny black circle on her forehead with a fuzzy, curvy brush, never left the house unmarked. By midday, the Janlo would begin to crust, crumbled bits of mascara landing on her cheeks or chin. My mother carried her mascara in her purse. Even at the height of tax season with its 16-hour workdays, at the first sight of crumble, she would take a moment to go to the bathroom, wash off the remains of the mascara, and reapply, determined to keep her third eye intact. I used to think my mother was an embarrassment. Her silky clothes and glittering jewelry contrasted so sharply with the hairspray stiffened perms and acid wash mom jeans of my classmates' mothers. Her brownness in a white world already marked us as other. Why did she need to heighten the distinction? In Jersey City around this time, white supremacists, self-proclaimed dot busters, chased Indian women down the street, beat them when they caught them. The way to stay safe, I thought, was to blend in. And my dazzling mother, dazzling in both her style and her personality, never blended into the bland linoleum and polyester environs of 1980s West Virginia. I shushed my mother when she spoke to me in Gujarati in public, its pitch and tone so different than that of English. Speak English, I would demand, refusing to acknowledge her if she wouldn't. Children can be so cruel, the saying goes, and I was living proof. I curse my cruelty now when I can't find the word in Gujarati to communicate a complex idea. Or when I wear a sari and my mother's response is that I look weird because she can't reconcile my short hair with traditional clothing. I want to believe that my message of assimilation, pushed so strongly on my mother, was born of my need for safety, both my own and my mother's. But this safety came at tremendous cost. My mother's saris now gather dust in her closet, only worn on the most special of occasions. 2. Pamela Circle was never a flag-waving neighborhood in the 80s and 90s. My neighbors' yards did not boast flagpoles. Their porches lacked flag holders. Flapping American flags were flown in schoolyards, not front yards. Flapping Confederate flags were flown in yards in other neighborhoods I learned very early not to trespass through. But on my street, the main morning sounds were those of birds chirping and basketballs pounding on pavement, not red, white, and blue bunting flapping in the breeze. Until late September in 2001, that is, when my parents took a trip to Portland, Oregon. They sat in their rental car at a stoplight downtown when a group of white men approached, banged on the hood, and rocked the car. The men screamed epithets and curses and the favorite phrase of white supremacists everywhere, hurled at those of us who are not white. Go back to where you came from. The light changed. My father slammed the gas pedal, charging forward, unconcerned about whether he ran over anyone's feet in the process. Later that same fall, on a Greyhound bus in Logan, West Virginia, less than an hour from our home, white passengers tackled an older Indian man and pinned him to the floor. They viewed his frequent trips to the bathroom as suspicious, instead of being the result of a failing prostate. They only removed their knees from his back when police arrived to take him off the bus. For 25 years, precisely the same amount of time he'd spent living in India, my father had worked to make West Virginia feel like home. And then, any glimmer of insider status he had gained in 2.5 decades evaporated between the hours of 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. on September 11th of 2001. After their trip, my father promptly went to Castro Hardware and purchased a massive American flag decal emblazoned with the saying, "Proud to be an American." He taped it to our glass front door, leaving sticky residue marks of many crooked attempts before he felt satisfied that it was straight. Another flag got taped into the back windshield of his blue Toyota van. A third got placed in a holder on the porch. 640 miles away in Madison, Wisconsin, I compulsively went across the street every afternoon to check on the Punjabi Sikhs who ran the gas station, using them as a proxy for my parents. 4 days after 9/11, Balbir Singh Sodhi, a Punjabi man my father's age, was murdered at his gas station in Arizona by Frank Silverroque, a white supremacist who shouted, "I am a patriot, and I stand for America all the way," when arrested. So these brown skin and turban were all it took for him to be interpreted as a threat, as a terrorist, as someone whose murder was justified. I did not believe my father's flags would keep him safe, but I couldn't ask him to take them down. I struggled with his assertion of patriotism towards a country that had only shown me ambivalence regarding my existence, and simultaneously lived in fear of what might happen to my parents if the Confederate flag wavers of other neighborhoods found their way to our street, so profoundly apolitical and welcoming up to this point. My parents' professional lives as doctors and accountants may have buffered them from the worst of West Virginia's ugly racism before 9/11. I, on the other hand, felt its effects from the age of 6, when a chubby, rat-tailed kindergartner approached me in the schoolyard, slapped me across the face, and hit me with the ugliest of racial slurs, illustrating that in West Virginia, there were only 2 categories that seemed to matter when it came to race: white and not white. And again, when fans of the opposing middle school basketball team screamed "Mr. Miyagi" and "Speedy Gonzalez" and "Where's your papoose" every time I walked on the court, showering me with trash and epithets, then pissed on our school bus at the end of the game. And again, when a high school classmate with his heavily gelled mullet and black Metallica t-shirt pulled over his enormous belly called me camel jockey and sand nigger every day during shop class, and our teacher pretended not to hear him. Until 9/11, my parents did not question their belonging in America. America provided them work, wealth, the opportunity to live a kind of life impossible to imagine in India, and to bring family members in India into a slowly growing middle class. Meanwhile, I, exposed daily to the ugliest manifestations of American ignorance, received continual reminders that I did not belong. If the flag could protect my parents from this venom and from the thick, incapacitating doubt that such venom shuttles to the brain, I would not ask them to take it down. 3. I can't remember when I began to openly flaunt my West Virginia roots, to wear t-shirts emblazoned with images of West Virginia and the lyrics to Country Roads, to proudly share every historical and cultural factoid I collected during my time living in the state and have continued to collect after leaving. I can, however, remember the first time a white man in West Virginia told me, go back to where you came from. At a gas station in Sissonville in the fall of 1995, in between chugs from his 40-ounce beer bottle. And the second time, on the side of the road in Nashville, Tennessee, in the summer of 1996, screamed out a car window. And the third time at Ogilvy Park in Wheeling in the fall of 1998, where a leering cowboy held up his hand and said, how, mocking a Lakota greeting. He asked me what tribe I was from. And when I responded that I was not that kind of Indian, proceeded to spit hate in my face. And again, in the summer of 2019, when the newspaper headlines announced that our white male president scolded a group of black and brown congresswomen using that very same phrase. I hate the way my body responds to acts of racism. Where others are able to stay calm and unaffected or angrily fight back, I simply disintegrate. My eyes blur, my temples pound, and I catalog counter arguments in my mind, but my dry mouth, the fear squeezing my chest cavity, prevents me from saying a word. I want in those moments to assert my Americanness, my West Virginianness, to pull out the birth certificate detailing my birth at Thomas Hospital in Charleston, West Virginia, in the heart of the Kanawha Valley. That muddy river valley, those green mountains, those smoking chemical stacks, they are where I come from. So much so that I'm writing this essay in a room in my house entirely dedicated to the state of West Virginia. The walls are decorated with a wedding ring quilt, a painting of the New River Gorge, and a map of West Virginia that dates back to the late 1880s. My light source is a lamp from the Blanco glassblowing factory in Milton, 20 minutes from where I grew up. I want to show my doubters that I'm an expansive encyclopedia of knowledge about West Virginia, most of which I learned in my 8th grade West Virginia Studies course, or have memorized from the actual West Virginia Encyclopedia, my favorite coffee table book. Do you know your state bird and animal? If you're not from West Virginia, do you know your state bird and animal? Well, I see like that, maybe one or two. Well, mine are the cardinal and the black bear. Can you name every celebrity to come out of your home state? Here we go. Chuck Yeager was born in Myra long before he flew his plane so fast that he broke the sound barrier. Jerry West was from Cheyenne, our Zeke from Cabin Creek, years before he made the NBA All-Star team 14 times. Walter D. Myers was born in Martinsburg before he became a phenomenal writer for young adults. Henry Louis Gates Jr. and his brilliant brain spent their formative years in Kaiser. Randy Moss first played football in the backyards of Rand, and Lou Holtz did the same in Follinsby. And Jennifer Garner wasn't born in West Virginia, but she lived there for most of her teenage years before kicking ass on Alias, where her code name on missions was often, well, was it? Come on, y'all, you know, what was the code name? Mountaineer, exactly. There are Americans whose ancestors have lived in the same state for centuries who don't always know as much about their states as I do. This is a fact. And it is also a fact that knowledge is not the marker of belonging in America that I want it to be. When congresswomen born and raised in the United States are being told to return to the places they came from on the basis of their skin color and their last names, I find myself questioning when or whether our country will ever see people who look like me, my parents, or my child as American. In the absence of a body that knows how to effectively respond to racism, I wrap myself in my home shirt, with the state of West Virginia replacing the O, in much the same way that my mother wrapped herself in 6 yards of silk and sari, or my father wrapped himself in the US flag, as though fabric can protect us, as though fabric will make it impossible for angry men to see through the cloth to the skin below. Thanks. All right.
As you can see, she's great at leading a class. You know that she is a teacher as well. So she's basically leading her own discussion, which I love.
Mike.
See,
Mike.
Exactly. So now she.
I didn't feel like I needed a mic. Were you guys okay?
I'm a little quieter, so I'll try it. Thank you so much for talking about this book. I have loved all of the essays, and I feel like everybody is really going to relate, no matter if they're from West Virginia or not, they're queer or not, they're South Asian or not. I mean, a lot of what you wrote about evokes such a sense of place, such a sense of home, but then also the conflicts that you feel about whether you actually belong wherever you end up. I mean, what was it like writing through some of those emotions that I'm sure you felt all through your life? And when did you feel like an essay was done and this issue had finally been written through?
I feel like every time I read this, I'm like, oh, this isn't done. So I don't know if I ever am going to feel like it's done, but I feel like it's the best representation of my thinking in the moment when I wrote it. Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways I've been writing this book my whole life, right? I feel like I had these questions about belonging and identity that were the questions that I was preoccupied with for as long as I can imagine being conscious. And it's a funny thing. I remember talking to an Indian writer who was born and raised in India. And she said, you Americans, like, you're so preoccupied with identity. She's like, that's just not a thing for us. Like, self-identity is not the thing that I'm worried about. Like, my identity separate from my community is not a thing I think about. And she's like, it's all I feel like American writers write about. And I was like, yeah, like, yes, I don't know what to tell you. Wasn't born where you're born. And for me, questions of identity are, I think, the most interesting ones in lots of ways. So the questions were there for a really long time. Answering them took a lot longer. I've lived outside of West Virginia for as long as I lived in it at this point. And I think that in a lot of ways, I had to have that much time away to be able to look at that experience and have enough distance and perspective to write about it without falling too far into any one of the categories, like falling too far into nostalgia, falling too far into anger, falling too far into any one emotion. I feel like this was the point at which I could kind of like hold all of the feelings with balance. And really, I think I started writing really seriously these essays in about 2015, which was right around the time when everyone wanted to talk about Appalachia all the time, how the rise of Trump was the responsibility of, 3 states, Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia, somehow won an election with their 10 electoral votes. And, I was living in Boston, and before 2015, like when I would tell people where I was from, their kind of reaction would be like, that's weird. Like, we didn't know there were Indian people in West Virginia. And I'd be like, well, yes, there are. I am one. There were some of us. We're here. But then, like, in 2015, like, here I am in Boston, and these people are like theoretically very highly educated, supposedly progressive people who are just like spewing increasingly hateful and stereotypical rhetoric about the place that I was from. And I thought for a long time that like no one would care about this story of randomly growing up Indian in West Virginia. And then the more I heard them talk, I was like, well, I actually think I have to write this story about growing up Indian in West Virginia, because you don't understand that there are immigrants in West Virginia. You don't understand there are Black people in West Virginia. You don't understand that there are queer people in West Virginia. You have this perception of whiteness and homogeneity that's like letting you really flatten this place. And so I was just trying to think about how to like unflatten the narrative a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think we're all very glad that you chose to write about all of this. And another thing that I was really struck by is how much you write about your family, of course. But as I am the child of immigrants and my parents are from the Philippines, anybody who's the child of immigrants will know, and you especially explore this in Shame, this idea of keep not airing your dirty laundry, not telling people what's wrong in your family, especially people who are outside of your culture. And so I know that I would have been very, very concerned about how my family would perceive some of this, and you talk about it in some of the essays, but can you talk a little bit about what you expected and how that's evolved as you become more comfortable as a writer and become more public as a writer?
I expected for a lot of people to only have a shame response. Because like this is not a thing that I go back one generation, 2 generations, like Indian women weren't doing this at all. Indian women writing nonfiction, like even in my generation, I can name for you the like 6 Indian American women who are nonfiction writers. Like fiction is a different space. You can hide, right? It can kind of be your story. It can kind of not be your story. There's ambiguity there. So like I knew that doing this was taking steps away that were going to be really hard. And I also spent a lot of time thinking about who is served by silence. And I kind of came to the conclusion that that sort of shame and silence pressure is about serving people who already have power. And that's in the dynamics of a family that can often be men and elders. In the dynamics of like our society, I think it's often white and wealthy people for whom like shame and silence are the way we keep things going the way they've been going. And I kind of felt like I didn't want to serve that. I didn't want that to be the driver of my decisions about whether I wrote about this or not. And he knew that it was going to be hard for people. But I also knew what it was like to grow up without mirrors and how hard that was. My therapist has this metaphor she uses with me a lot where she talks about when you go first, you like are just bushwhacking. You don't know where you're going. It's just trees. It's just forest. And you're just like, I don't know. Like I'm going to just like cut and cut and cut. And maybe I'll find something at the end of that. Right. I was bushwhacking because there was nobody ahead of me who was like me. And I don't wish that on anybody. I think people deserve mirrors. I think they deserve to be able to pick up a book and be like, that's us on the cover. Like, this is me, and this is people like me, and like I can find myself somewhere in this, and maybe if I see myself somewhere in this, it helps me to have an easier path. And ultimately, I feel like the weight of that became a lot stronger than the weight of like shame or like personal relationship dynamics, because I think for lots of young queer kids, and certainly for young queer kids in Appalachia, like this is life or death stuff. I don't say that in a light way. I think if you don't get mirrors and you don't get validation, it can get really hard to keep going. And so in some ways, like I think that's who I wrote for, was like, yeah, there are going to be consequences for me personally in this, but there are lots of consequences for other people who I don't know personally, but who I know the consequences are really big for if stories like this don't happen.
Yeah, I mean, the first essay you wrote, and then also you have this beautiful chapter basically dedicated to your partner. Can you talk a little bit about writing about being queer and how important you felt that to be, especially when you had been, you had faced so many different derogatory names throughout your life, and even from some of your family members in India had really difficult conversations that made you, I'm sure, not want to talk more about it.
Yeah, I mean, it took me a really long time to figure out who I was, right? Way too long. And I'm like so proud of my students. I teach 8th and 9th graders, and like they have so much more clarity about themselves than I had when I was in 8th and 9th grade. I'm very jealous of them a lot of the time. I'm like, oh, how are you like this? But I think in part they're like that because they have so much more representation available to them, right? Like you can watch Netflix and you can find there are Desi characters on shows. There's queer characters on shows. There are queer Desi characters on shows now, right? Like, so I think that seeing that representation and seeing the power of it is almost the thing that made me be like, I think I want to add a layer to this, which is the Appalachian layer, which is not a piece that exists on Netflix or anywhere else. Like that is not a narrative about Appalachia that's out there yet. Let's hope. But I think that it did feel like, again, like I think there are personal risks. I think there are things that I'm gonna have to navigate because I wrote this. But ultimately, like it was too heavy not to write.
And what has your writing process been like? I mean, you have a lot going on in your life already. What was it like going through this, letting people know that you were going to write about them? And I mean, there's so many aspects, even in the chapters you've read, where it's kind of going through these things in your mind that you remember. How are you going back and listing all these things? I'm a reporter, so checking the facts on everything. When you're going through your nonfiction process, what's that like?
So lots of the things that I feel like are really descriptive are the things that I did again and again and again, right? So the first essay is like driving home from the airport, and all of us have driven home from that airport like hundreds of thousands of times, right? And could probably do it. I was like on the drive here today from West Virginia, I was like testing to see if I still remembered every exit on the highway, right? Like I know the name. I'm like, oh, there's Jane Lou. Got it. Okay, right? So there's like a piece in which I really relied on making sure that those like really detailed moments were the ones that I had like very grounded, repeated experiences with them. Or they were ones where it was like such a pivotal moment where it's like, it only happened once, but I'll never forget that slap, right? I think that in terms of like communicating with family, it was really complicated. Some of these essays were published independently prior to the publication of the book. So some of them were kind of in the world, some of them weren't. I don't think this book would exist if I had asked permission. In fact, I know it wouldn't exist if I had asked permission. And when Mira Jacob wrote Good Talk, I went to hear her read, and she talked about the fact that she made different choices with different people in her family about when they knew that there were some people who she shared drafts with, there were some people she shared the advanced copy with, and there were some people that she didn't share the book with until it was published. For that very reason, which is that she knew that if she were to share it with everybody at that draft stage, like it would just be shut down, and she wouldn't be able to go through with it because all that shame would just come down on her back in such a heavy way. And so I kind of took that as my guide, and like my sister read everything always, like before it was published, when it was in rough draft, like she was reading things. My mom read certain things and didn't read other things. It kind of was like this flow chart of like who's going to read what when and who's not going to read anything until it's all like done and here's the book and you can yell at me afterwards. So it wasn't like a blanket decision. It really was trying to figure out person by person, like what's the relationship, what can this person hold, and what can I hold from them, and what is going to be the stuff that's like too hard to hold and that would make it too hard to tell a story.
Yeah, and I was really struck by these two essays that you wrote about very complicated relationships. One is Chemical Bonds, which is about your father and basically how he relied on the chemical industry to give you the life that you grew up in. And then also Blue Red Divide, which is about a neighbor who you see on Facebook spewing views that you feel are abhorrent.
Yeah.
And so what was that like? I mean, going through these really complicated, messy relationships, what was that like for you personally as you're working through all of these things?
Those are the two essays that like make it really hard to sleep even now. Like the book has been out for like 6 weeks at this point, and I think they were the two essays that I had a hard time sleeping. The minute I knew it was going to be published, I was like, stop sleeping, right? Because of those two essays. Still not really sleeping because of those two essays. They're really hard and they're sticky, and they're sticky for different reasons. But I think what I hoped to do in both of those essays was to think about how we understand why people make the choices they make, and how can we end up making such different choices from people who we really love and people who have really strong relationships with, but whose choices we're struggling to understand. And so I tried really hard in both of those essays for it not to be about condemning or blaming those people for the choices they were making, but rather to think about like my role in it, right? In Chemical Bonds, a lot of what I'm trying to explore there is the fact that like I have the privileges I have because my dad didn't say no, and he didn't say no because we were there. He couldn't say no; it wasn't an option to say no, right? And in the Blue Red Divide, I think it's like really exploring like how is the place where I grew up really fallen apart, and like what is it like if you have lived in a place for 90 years and watched it go from being a place where it was healthy and you could be successful and your family could thrive and a high school diploma was all you needed to have a career and with a pension have good healthcare and benefits. Like you kind of had that experience, and then you've watched the place where you lived fall apart, right? Like how does that make you think differently and understand the world differently than me, who like left when I was 18, and knows that decline because like I see it when I go back, but I don't go back but once or twice a year, which is a really different thing from every day like driving down the street and seeing buildings that used to be functional and operational shuttered, right? Or like hearing about overdoses in like this neighbor's house and that neighbor's house and this family member and that. I mean, it just, I think we don't do what I try. I'm not saying I succeeded, but I think what I was trying to do in those essays is something I don't think we do enough anymore in this country. I think we are really quick to put people in corners and just be like, we don't agree with each other, we're not on the same page, without trying to actually figure out, well, why are we not on the same page? Like, what's making us position ourselves the way that we do? And that was, I think, so like holding those people with empathy and trying to understand is, I think, ultimately what I was trying to do there. And hoping that like, if that was the orientation, like that empathy is the driving force and the thing that people will hold on to as they walk away.
And what kind of reactions are you getting? I mean, are there any surprising ones, either good or bad? What are you hearing from the people in your life? And then also from the people that you're hearing from on this tour, kind of?
It's been like really lovely. Surprisingly lovely. I haven't gotten hate mail yet. I'm waiting for my hate mail, but I haven't gotten any, which is great. I think the most surprising thing that's been super lovely has been like young queer people in Appalachia who are like so excited, and just like every day I get a DM from a kid in like Nicholas County who's like, I just read your book and I'm so excited. And I'm like, oh my God, like I never thought that, right? I think another interesting thing has been, I've done a bunch of interviews with like Appalachian podcasts where like the interviewer is like a white cis man who's like, I thought I'd have nothing in common with this book when I picked it up. And yet somehow I was reading it and I found myself in it. And I think that's been really lovely because I wrote a really specific book, but somehow it has managed to have some universality that I'm not sure how happened. I didn't do that on purpose, but it's been a lovely sort of after effect is to be like, oh, like maybe there is something to the fact that like it is the specificity that like almost makes the connection possible. And I think it's like the anti-JD Vance, right? Where it's like, I think he tried to really paint Appalachia with a very broad brush as being like all the same thing. And people by and large in Appalachia were pretty pissed about that book because nobody recognized themselves in it, right? And then here's a book that's like, here's this teeny niche community and experience. And people were like, wait, here I am in this book. And it's like, oh, okay, like this is what we should be doing. Like, we should be talking about these experiences and like talking about all the different communities in Appalachia and talking about all that complexity. And that's where people will find themselves, as opposed to like when you reduce people to stereotypes and tropes, nobody recognizes themselves in that.
Yeah, and I think actually you shouldn't be surprised at all that there's so many universal themes. I mean, I knew I could see myself kind of as a queer Asian woman, but it didn't matter if I was just that. So many of the themes of belonging, about home, about whether you feel like you belong where you grew up, just will resonate with so many people. And in that sense, I mean, you are bushwhacking, and we all thank you for that. But who were some of the writers that you kind of turned to when you were looking at this about who did you want to kind of channel when you were writing some of these?
I'm super lucky to have 3 Gujarati American mentors. I don't know how I found them, or really they found me because I didn't find them. But there's an incredible professor at the University of Pittsburgh. Her name's Geeta Kothari. She's a phenomenal writer, and she has just been like this doesn't exist without her. Like, she's been there since 2017, like kind of helping me think about it. And a lot of her essays, I think, helped me to think about how you write about family and complexity in ways that hold people with love. And then there's actually a queer Appalachian Desi writer named Rahul Mehta, who's about 10 years older than I am. And they're a fiction writer, but they were one of the reviewers when I submitted this book to West Virginia Press, University Press. They were one of the reviewers for the book and gave me tons of really good feedback and support through the process. And then in 2020, an incredible essay collection was written by a woman named Sejal Shah. It's called This Is One Way to Dance. It's a beautiful essay collection, but it's about identity and place and belonging. And that essay collection, I think, really just like affirmed for me that like there was a place for these stories in the world.
Yeah, well, it's so beautiful. I want to make sure we have time to get some questions from the audience, but thank you so much for reading. It's an amazing book of essays, and everybody should read.
Thanks.
So everybody, please open up the floor.
So I'm not sure we heard the first part, the answer to the first part of one of your questions when it was about the reaction. And I think you started with reaction by people in the book.
Oh yeah, I love that you're calling me out on I'm supposed to follow up. I'm the investigator. This man should be up here. But yeah, that is a very good question. Do you want to keep asking?
It is a good question.
But yeah, I mean, we would love to hear more about that.
Yeah.
How is your family reacting reading through some of this now that it's actually out in the world?
Well, I guess when I think about family of the book, I think broadly, like not blood family. I think that's one of the big themes in this book is that my blood family, by and large, outside of my nuclear family, was 8,000 miles away. So like a whole lot of people in this room are my family. They're more my family than people in India are. Like that's the reality of the situation. So like even the cover of this book was kind of like an interesting thing because the publisher was like, can you send us some images as inspiration for the designer? And I was like, oh, I'll just send this picture. Not thinking that the picture was going to be the cover, but thinking that it would be inspiration for the cover. And then they came back and were like, well, we want this blurry, uncentered picture to be the cover of the book. And I was like, that's amazing. I was hoping, but also I didn't ask any of these people if it was okay because I didn't think you were going to do that. So then I had to call everyone and be like, so you're going to be on the cover of a book and you kind of can't say no because it's too late, but I'm going to make you think you can say no, but it's really too late. And people were amazing. Like they were so, I mean, Faris is in here, like 50% of his family is in this picture. More than that, Faris actually looks like he's in this picture because his dad and him look exactly the same. It's eerie, but they were just excited. Like I think one of my mom's best friends, like when I called her to talk to her about it, she was like, I never thought that my picture would ever be on the cover of the book. Like, that never occurred to me, and I'm just thrilled that it is. Similarly, like there's an essay in this book that's about my aunties, right? The 9 women who really played a huge role in like shaping my identity. And like a lot of those aunties have been like super lovely about like just feeling really honored that they're there and feeling like that relationship being documented on the page has felt really powerful to them. My mom was like, this is a very honest book. And we raised you to be an honest person. So, you know, there you go. I'm like, okay, I'll take that. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, yesterday I was at dinner with some of the aunties and uncles and they were like, well, you know, you're your dad's daughter, so you don't know how to lie. And I was like, is that an insult or a compliment? I'm not sure, but I'm going to take it as a compliment because why do you want people to lie? So it's been, I think it is surprising for people. Like, I think it's not what you do, right? And so that's going to be like a thing that people have to get comfortable with. And it's not like overwhelmingly, you know, like 100%. Oh, it's just like smooth sailing. Like they're even with my in-laws, like they both. There's one essay in particular that sort of talks about some of our funny dynamics, and they both have called and be like, "So about this part in the book, that's their part." Like, well, why did you have to put the part in about how I'm worried about you getting put in the trunk of the car, right? Like, there is that stuff that you have to navigate. Again, I hope that like my goal with all of this is not just that in the book, but also in life, like. We have really long relationships. We have a lot of love for each other. I think that we can kind of like see our way through the hard parts and the complex parts because I think the goal of this is to really like honor a community of people who are pretty incredible and made a way for themselves in a space that is incredibly unlikely and did it with a lot of grace and a lot of courage and like raised incredible children. Who are like half of them are in this room right now. You know, like that in itself, I think, is a tribute to this community of people. And so I think that I think we'll work our way through it, but it is not, I don't know. It takes time. I was in West Virginia yesterday, and like was at a bookstore with like all the aunties and uncles, and like, they were taking selfies and they were getting their books signed, and I was like, okay, I think this is good. Like, this seems like we're making good progress. So we're just taking it a step at a time and seeing how it goes.
I will be open for other questions, but I also wondered, are there any essays that you wrote where you kind of surprised yourself, where you started writing about one thing and quickly became something else over drafts?
Yeah, chemical bonds is the essay that's that essay for me. That essay went through like 27 drafts. And the first drafts of that essay were like all about chemicals. Like the very, very first draft of that essay was a collage essay where I talked about like the different chemicals that like I was super aware of as a kid because they were like so prevalent. So like mercaptan. I've known the smell of mercaptan since I could smell, because the plant, like the smell of mercaptan would just be in the air. Like when you lived in Cross Lanes, like the air didn't smell like air, it smelled like chemicals, right? Or like my dad would bring dry ice home all the time and I'd play with dry ice. Or Sevin was a pesticide that he used to kill lice in my hair. Like, like that was the first version of that essay, was like, here's this weird relationship that I have with chemicals. And it took me a really long time to get from like the Vivian Gornick talk is a really famous essayist who writes about this idea of like the situation versus a story, right? So the situation is like the thing that's happening, but the story is like, well, what are the implications of that thing? So for a long time with that chemical bonds essay, I knew the situation. Like I knew that chemicals played this like outsized role in our life. I knew that Bhopal happened when I was 5 and like was a really big thing in my family. And like I knew those things, but I didn't know what those things meant. And it took me, I had to live into what that essay meant, which is I had to live until my boss tried to close my school, and I had to be like, well, being a good employee would mean letting them close it. But that would actually be really terrible and damaging for the students who are ultimately like who I feel most responsible to. So like I've been raised to be a good worker. Like, what does it mean in this situation to do my job right? Like, what is it? And then it was like that experience that then made me think about my dad. And the fact that like I could take all these risks and blow up people in the newspaper and be really ridiculous on Twitter and like I was ridiculous. I was like sneaking into our central office and like dropping books at people's desks that were like books about school closure. I wasn't allowed in there. I was just like, I was doing all these things that were like ridiculous and nonsense, but I knew I could because I knew that if I got fired, like I had a safety net. And my dad didn't have one. And so it was like not until like I was put in not the same situation at all, but at least in a situation where like questions about ethics and questions about our relationship to our employer like were coming up for me, that I was then able to be like, oh, I think I know what all of that stuff meant now. I think this is an essay about how our choices are really circumscribed by our safety nets and our privilege. It took me a really long time to figure that out. That was what that essay was trying to be about, and not just about weird smelly chemicals and weird like experiences with those chemicals, but that really it's about for immigrants and their children, how they experience work differently and how they experience risk differently because of the stakes in play for them.
Yeah, and I think that really showed. It was beautifully written and just so layered. I'm glad you went through all 27 drafts, even if you yes, in the back.
Oh, cool.
Hi, Chuck.
Hi, it's good to see you, Neema. So, first of all, reading this book made my native West Virginian heart swell with pride. And one of the reasons why is because I kind of see this as sort of the antidote to Habilio.
Can I get you to blurb that on here?
and it introduces some nuance to a region that often doesn't get it. And so I'm wondering, like, you mentioned about how you got a lot of reactions of like, oh, there's queer Indian people in West Virginia. And I'm wondering if you've heard from people where it goes a little bit further than that, and it actually encourages them to like kind of investigate, look into the region more, and maybe apply their own nuances to it rather than just saying, oh, this is neat. Because, and I think you kind of partially answered that already, but like even coming from West Virginia, reading this, I was like, wow, this is, a unique experience. I had no idea about.
Yeah, just so you all know, that's Chuck Cora. He is one of the co-hosts of an incredible podcast called Appalachia. If you have not listened to it, you need to listen to Appalachia. It's an amazing, amazing voice around sort of Appalachian identity and creating space for all kinds of different Appalachian people. I think that part of what I did in the book, especially in the last essay, which is called Only Generation Appalachian, was to really start to cue to other Appalachian writers. Right. And I think that's also what I feel like I've tried to do a lot in the writing that I've done in relation to the book. So that even if someone doesn't have that question inherently in themselves, to be like, oh, if there were Indian people, there were probably also Black people. And there were probably also Filipino people. And there were probably also all kinds of other communities there that like I can push that. Right. And so I can be like, well, if you read this, here's 7 other writers you should read, and here's the communities they represent. I haven't necessarily seen that happening organically. But I think that is the goal. I think that's also the goal of the title, right? And I think the title, like, just so you know, this wasn't the original title of the book. I wanted the title to be a Hindu hillbilly elegy because I'm a petty person and I really wanted it. And then my publisher was like, you don't want to do that. Like, that's not a good idea. You don't want to like tie yourself to that book. And yet, like, without me calling it that, every review has tied it to that book. So I think I could have gone with my title. But I think the another, like, that's kind of what I'm hoping to do with that word, right? Is be like, well, it's another. It's not the other. It's another because there are a whole bunch of anothers. And maybe that starts to just push your brain to consider that if there's one another, there are also many other anothers. And like, I hope people get there, but I wouldn't say that I feel like I've seen that. I will say, I think like my mom has been really interesting because she started to read like a lot of the different people who are referenced in the book and have been referenced in conversations. Like her reading around Appalachia is definitely diversified. She's a big reader. So I think it's possible it's happening for people, but I wouldn't say that I know. Outside of my mom, I don't know. If anyone else is reading Frank X. Walker, but she definitely is, which is great. Yeah, Kelly.
What's next?
This has been very all-consuming since about January. I didn't really know anything about the marketing of a book process. That's been a big learning experience and it's quite time-consuming. But prior to that, last summer I started a second essay collection. It's called The Book of Broken Rules, and it's about like all the rules that I was sort of that were kind of put down onto me when it came to like gender and race and class, and then like what it means to be the person who just breaks all the rules all the time. So what are the implications of being a rule breaker? It's kind of what the next collection's about. Yeah.
So I think that a lot of us can identify with knowing a Mr. B in our lives. I'm wondering if other people have reached out to you with their stories and if maybe that's changed the way that you Mr. B now.
Yeah, that is actually an essay that I feel like I've gotten a lot of response to. Basically saying what you're saying, which is like, I have a Mr. B and I like have been trying to figure out what to do.
And just to, if you haven't read the essay, a Mr. B is one of her neighbors that she grew up very fond of.
He's like my grandfather.
Yeah.
Like I didn't have grandparents. I mean, I did, but they were in India. I didn't have a relationship with them. He was my grandfather for all intents and purposes. And yeah, right around the 2016 election, started to post things that were like really, really xenophobic and just very confusing. Like as someone who really embraced our immigrant family, like started to create a lot of dissonance for me about like, how does this go together? Like you're either not seeing us or like you didn't ever see us. Like those are the options here, right? They're not good, either one. So what's been interesting is people saying like that reading that essay has made them kind of try to slow down in those relationships and like try to like hold space. And not to say that they know how to resolve it yet, or not to say that like, and now I have a completely new perspective on this, but rather that like, it sort of pushes back on their tendency to write off, And then in times when they are like tempted to just be like, forget it, like I can't, right? That instead of blocking, they snooze, which I don't think is a small thing. I think snoozing means there's an opportunity to come back to each other, right? When we block, we like sever. And so I do, that's been like a really interesting conversation about just like, what do we do when we have really disparate views from people like who we really love? And is there a way to not sever and to kind of acknowledge that like not severing doesn't mean it's good, but that if we don't sever, there's still the potential for like us to evolve into a different place. I've heard that from multiple people, and I think I actually think that's like why I wrote that essay in some ways, was because I knew it wasn't just me. I knew that this is a thing for a lot of people. I would bet that of the people in this room, almost every single person in here has a Mr. B in their life, and has probably like held a lot of pain and just really struggled to figure out like, what do we do, right? That experience that we're all holding as individuals, like I think we have to think about it collectively. We're so polarized right now. And I think if like our tendency is just to block, I don't think we ever get away from that polarization. So we have to figure out like, I don't know, like, can we at least stay here? And then maybe if we're here, like maybe we'll see like the one thing that we can kind of come back a little bit closer on, and then another thing, and try to figure out what it looks like to restore those relationships.
If I could ask one
Yeah.
more, sorry. I wonder if you could sort of compare your, I don't know, maybe it's comfort level or love of place. I know you've been in Boston for a long time, and there are a lot of Indian folks in Boston, I presume, and obviously a lot of queer people in Boston. So the comfort level must be very different, I suppose, but you obviously have a lot of pride and love for a place that was great, but very difficult for you in the first half of your life. So I just wonder how you compare your sense of comfort and love of place.
It's funny. I've lived in Boston for a very long time. I don't love Boston. I find it a very hard place to live. It's really cold. Both like weather cold, but also people are cold. Like it's hard to know people. Like it's hard to get past the veneers there. And there are Indian people, but it's like, for me, like the rituals of Hinduism, like I have come to realize only matter for me when I'm doing them with the people who I did them with as a kid. If I'm not in the Garba circle with Jyoti Auntie and Indra Auntie and my mom, like, and Shava Auntie and Chanda, I don't want to do it. Like, it doesn't mean anything to me. So I've gone to those things. I go to the suburbs and I go do the Garba, and I'm like, I don't know anybody here. This doesn't, like, I feel nothing. Like, and I'm just gonna go home because this is far and I don't feel connected. Like at the same time, like, I don't have to count how many brown people there are in Boston. Like I can live a life where like I am reflected and represented in lots of different ways. And that's powerful. It's a really powerful thing. It would be a really hard thing to give up. But I wouldn't say I feel more comfortable because culturally, like I think I'm really Appalachian. And I didn't know that until I left Appalachia. I didn't know what I was, but it became very clear to me quickly after I left Appalachia that the culture of that place was just as much part of me as being Indian is a part of me. And Appalachian culture and New England culture might as well be like Indian culture and Appalachian culture are closer to each other than New England culture is to either of those two things. So, and that's a fact. I could write a whole essay on that. I kind of did, but yeah, I think that comfort of representation is like one thing, but there's also like the comfort of like being with people whose ways are your ways. And I don't feel like I have that in Boston. I feel like I have that most when I'm with the people in the communities, like with my Pamela Circle people or with in the Indian community. Like those are the spaces where I think I feel like most at home even now.
So we'll begin the let's have her move to DC. You all want to start it tonight?
I have what I hope is a fun question. You write a little bit about the similarities around food and Appalachian and Indian culture. Do you have a favorite like fusion Indian Appalachian food?
I do. which is in Gujarati food, there's this thing called murabbo, and murabbo is like it's like a sweet mango chutney that you usually eat with, like, it's on your plate with everything else. Like, there's not courses, right? In a Gujarati meal in a thali, it's like all there. The sweet is there, salty is there, the savory is there. It's all in the same thing. My mom would make murabbo out of, like, she'd do like fried apples, or she'd do rhubarb. And so, like, it was this kind of cool where, like, mango wasn't that easy to get, and it wasn't good for the most part. Like, if you got a mango in West Virginia, you got a long way. Not so good at that point. So, like, kind of trying to be like, all right, what are the, like, tart sweet fruits and flavors of the space that I can, like, use in the same way? And so I really loved when she would do that. That's one of my favorite things. I like to say that my mom was like an original foodie, like before foodies were a thing, long before foodies were like a thing. Like, she, you know, like the Moosewood cookbook didn't come out until 1989 or 90. And my mom wrote a cookbook of vegetarian recipes that I then typed, and then we printed it and we bound it, and she sold it as a fundraiser for the local women's shelter. And, like, I was in Lexington on Monday, and I went to a friend's house, and she pulled down that cookbook and, like, had, like, flagged and posted in pages in it from, like, 30 years ago, right? I wonder if anyone else in here still has that cookbook. Hey, there we go, right? And, like, then there were these folks from West Virginia who were, like, also really curious about food and wanted to, like, think about vegetarian food. And so we would end up, like, we would go to people's houses, and they'd be, like, trying to make different things, and they'd come to our house. My mom didn't just cook Indian food. She cooked all kinds of food. Like, she was experimenting all the time. And ultimately, I think it was the value of breaking bread that was the driver, right? And it was like, we care about each other, and food is a way that we show care. And so, like, even though vegetarian food is very far outside of West Virginia schema when it comes to cooking, like, people were trying to figure it out because they wanted to show care. And my mom similarly was trying to figure it out because she wanted people to feel comfortable when they came to her table, and feel like they could access what was on the table. I can't tell you the number of people who, like, had their first Indian meal at my parents' house long before there was an Indian restaurant in Charleston. Like I get messages from old classmates that are like, I still miss your mom's puri. And I'm like, that was like 37 years ago. But okay. You know, like that, I think is a really powerful place, again, where I feel like that overlap between Indian and Appalachian culture is so strong. Just like that, we might not say I love you, but we cook for you, and, like, that counts. All right, I think.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming out. Thank you, Neema, for writing a fabulous book that everybody should buy, everybody should read.
Thank you all for coming out. I'll be up here to sign books if anybody wants to get a book signed.